Well, hello, my name is Olivia Parks. I am a AmeriCorps naturalist from Dorothy Pecaut Nature Center. I was a graduate from Iowa State University in 2018 and pretty fresh, pretty new in the field, but something I've always been passionate about is snakes. I've always been that kid who went out into the garden and collected garter snakes when I was little, so I didn't think anything more fitting than doing a program on this today. And of course, I had to use garter in the garden just because that is one of the snakes we will be talking about today. So I'll go ahead and get started. First, I always like talking about the class that snakes are from, Reptilia. So they are reptiles, of course, which means that they have vertebrates. They have scales or scute. So scute are actually from turtles. The scales that are on the back of the turtle shell are scute. They breathe with lungs, sorry, and they are cold-blooded, so that means that they're not able to self-regulate their body temperature. So a lot of times out in a warm day, you won't see too many because they need to make sure they don't overheat their bodies. And also in the winter, you don't see too many snakes either because they need to protect themselves from the cold. We will get into what they exactly do in the wintertime here in a little bit, but I'll continue with my list here. They are oviparous, which means they lay eggs. Some of you might say that snakes, snakes that don't lay eggs, and that is because they actually carry those eggs within themselves, hatch, and then they give birth to those eggs or live snakes. And of course, Reptilia comes from the Latin term creeping animals. So here I have a couple of graphics of snake anatomy. The first one here is of a snake skeleton, and the second one is kind of like the inside of a snake. I like having these up so you're able to see how the snake looks on the inside. You can see the skeleton, you can see all those little tiny little rib bones sticking out of the backbone. Something you guys might notice is missing is legs. So snakes do not have legs, right? That's the one thing that makes them different from most other reptiles. And that is actually because they evolved. Once upon a time, they did have 4 legs, but they evolved to not have them anymore. The snake anatomy, you can see that most of their body has been condensed into a very slim body. And you can see that that blue piece on that snake anatomy photographic is actually its lung. So a lot of snakes actually only have 1 lung, but some of them do have 2 lungs. But it is very elongated, so they're able to hold enough oxygen for their body. Some people like asking me, how do snakes move? So I like talking about that right now just because we do have the snake skeleton right at our disposal right here. So each one of those each one of those rib bones obviously have a muscle that's attached to them, right? So that controls how the snake is able to breathe. It contracts and releases that air into the body and out of the body. And it also controls that snake's movement. So those muscles in between each rib bone will actually move themselves, causing the snake to either propel themselves forward, get ready to strike, and hold their body nice and strong and able to not be so nice structure to them. And of course, I always like talking about the snake's skin and scales. A lot of people know that snakes shed their skin, as you can see in this video of our corn snake here at the Nature Center. His name is Hen, and he was rubbing all over his tank there. Let's see if I can restart that video. And you can see that skin on his head has already torn upward. So snakes have to shed their skin at least up to 12 times a year. And that is because they start growing and they need to make room for their body. Some people associate snakes with something that's slithery and slimy, but that's not so true for snakes. Typically, the snake has very dry skin, and that's kind of another reason why it needs to shed, because since it's so dry, it's not able to move and grow with the body. So every so often, about once a month here at the Nature Center, all 3 of our snakes shed at the same time. And you can always start to notice that because their eyes start becoming very milky, and you notice that they're not able to respond so much. That is because they become partially blind, and they pretty much react only to light changes. So when we open the door to get the snake out, they notice the light from the back room, and they kind of look at us like, I don't know what you are, please don't attack me. So that is one of the most vulnerable places a snake will be, and typically they'll be fairly aggressive at that point too. Now I'm going to go ahead and dive into snake behavior a little bit. This picture right in the middle that you guys see is kind of one I like showing people because it's hard to see the snake in there. I'll give you guys a few seconds to see if you can find it before I give it away. So this snake is actually a copperhead, and it is directly in the middle of the picture. I'm not sure if you are able to see my cursor, but I was kind of going over it right there. But they have adapted so well to be able to camouflage themselves in the leaf litter, and that's kind of the location that the copperhead likes to live in. Fortunately, we don't have copperheads here in this part of the state, but in the southeastern part of the state, they do have a few copperhead. Copperhead snakes are one of the most aggressive of the venomous snakes, and they are one of the ones that bite the most. So luckily, they don't have a huge fatality rate with their bites, but they are very aggressive, so you want to make sure you know what they look like. You'll be able to see a little bit better picture at the end of my slide here. Second thing I kind of like talking about is the coloration. So in the top corner, you can see kind of a snake that is all curled up on itself. That is actually a eastern hognose snake. There's a couple things I want to talk about him for, but you can see how the coloration of the picture and his body really well blends into the background. And also with that copperhead, it really blends into the background. They use that coloration so predators cannot get at them. Some of the predators that you'll know for snakes are things like hawks, owls, badgers are another big predator, which a lot of people don't really know about, and other birds of prey. A lot of the snakes will have to hide from them and try to avoid those predators. So one thing a lot of people like knowing about when you're trying to keep snakes away from your garden or out of your backyard is to mow your lawn very short to make it so snakes aren't able to hide in that short grass and that they're scared that they're going to be spotted by a hawk or something. Here I'm going to go ahead and talk about hibernation also. So I know at Adams Homestead in South Dakota, right over the river by us, Jody Motes had shared a goofy photo of a whole bunch of garter snakes sticking their heads out of a hole. So that is kind of what snakes do when they hibernate. A lot of snakes will actually go into a hibernaculum, which they sometimes have to travel fairly far to get to. And in that hibernaculum, there will be hundreds to thousands of snakes. And all of you guys can kind of think of Indiana Jones, that snake pit. That's pretty well describes what a hibernaculum up in Minnesota might look like. One of the things I learned when I was in school was one of the bigger hibernaculums for garter snakes is actually located on the border between Minnesota and Canada. And of course, we know snakes can be pretty defensive. Like I was talking about with the copperhead, they're pretty aggressive and they're very defensive. So rattlesnakes are one of the ones that a lot of people think of when they think of snakes. Luckily, the only ones that we might see around this area are the prairie rattlesnakes, and they're rarely recorded even in Iowa. They have a population up in Plymouth County, which is just north of Woodbury County, but they are pretty common up in South Dakota. So when I like kind of talking about rattlesnakes, because the first time I came into encounter one was when I was working out at Custer State Park. I was walking out of the building that I was getting off of work from, and me and two other coworkers were walking down to our cars, and all of a sudden we heard this rattle. So as soon as you hear that rattle, you need to stop. You need to freeze and try to use your eyes to try to find where that rattle is coming from. So the reason we always say freeze instead of start running the other way is because sometimes even the smallest movement will put that rattlesnake over the edge and they will strike. Rattlesnakes don't have to be in a striking position just to strike at you, and they can strike about half their body length. So you got to keep that in mind if you ever do see one. And it's kind of cool to see one, so maybe you want to take a picture. Don't get any closer than I would recommend 2 feet, because rattlesnakes can grow up to be about 4 to 5 feet long. Another funny defensive movement that a lot of snakes have are hognose snakes, and they play dead. So as soon as they feel threatened, they'll actually start reacting in a goofy way where they flip themselves over, they show their belly, they'll stick their tongue out, and they will musk everywhere. If you guys don't know what musk means, it means they'll release an odor that smells terrible, and it will make it smell like they are dead. So that's something that some snakes start to do. And another thing that hognose do, you can see in the top corner photo, is they start flattening their head. The reason some snakes start flattening their head is because they want to make themselves appear to be like a cobra. A lot of rattlesnakes and venomous snakes will have a diamond-shaped head. So if a snake can attempt to make their head look like a diamond or have the flares like a cobra, they will attempt to do that to make themselves look more aggressive and like people don't want to mess with them. And obviously, some of these defense mechanisms will work. Some of them will actually cause sad things to happen to these snakes. Next, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about snake movement. So there are about 4 different main ways that snakes will move. And those are all put into that image there. The first one at the top, you can see that they're kind of scrunched up in the first one. So they actually put their weight on 2 separate parts of their body in that first image. They will put the weight in the back of their body to propel themselves forward. And then they'll put the weight in the front of their body to be able to pull themselves forward. And they will continuously go back and forth and do that until they get to the location that they want. Serpentine is one that we're most familiar with because that is what most snakes in the environment that we live in will use. So they put pressure and weight and in certain parts of their body, so they're able to use their environment and push themselves forward. Side winding is the next one, and those aren't too common around this area. That is because most snakes who use this are living in a desert area, and it's most useful in dunes. So there, you can kind of see in between each snake, that in between phase, that is them pushing against the top of the dune to push themselves forward. And a lot of times they'll move at a sideward angle. So that's why it's called side winding. And of course, the last one, which is the caterpillar. I like thinking about caterpillars, so that's why I tend to call it that one. And that's when they use small points on their body to lift themselves up and push themselves forward and kind of wiggle, and that's how they are able to move forward. Some things that people like making jokes about are snakes fly and snakes swim. Well, it's not completely wrong, but completely true either. So the rumors of snakes flying actually come from Southwest Asia. And they're actually about snakes that tend to glide out of trees or jump out of trees and use their body to look like a serpentine. So they look like they are gliding and jumping through the air. So it looks like they are flying, but really they're just using their body in order to become more aerodynamic and jump from one tree to the next tree. Those snakes tend to be up in trees because being in Southwest Asia, there's a lot more trees and they tend to predate on birds. And of course, swimming. So there is actually a sea snake, which uses swimming and the serpentine-like swimming technique to swim and go after their prey. I always like thinking about fishes and how they kind of move back and forth in order to swim forward. It's very similar to how snakes will swim, and they are able to hold their breath for a very, very long time. Of course, we do have some water snakes here in Iowa, but they aren't able to stay underwater for very long. They actually have to come surface up and tend to rest on the side of lakes and rivers. So next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about food. Right here we have our resident bull snake, and she is enjoying her meal a couple weeks ago. Snakes are carnivores, and a lot of the snakes that live around here will eat small rodents, rabbits, birds, but some other ones are known to eat insects, frogs, toads, eggs, sometimes other smaller reptiles, aka the king snake, which is why they have the name king snake, fish, earthworms, or slugs. And snakes don't really require a daily meal like humans or other animals because since they are cold-blooded, they actually need the warmth to digest their food. So if they have a colder body temperature, they don't need to, that won't allow them to digest. And fun fact about wintertime for snakes, they tend to eat very little in the fall because once they hit hibernation time, if they have anything in their stomach, it will actually rot down and it will make them very sick and maybe even be fatal towards the snake. Smaller snakes will eat more often. They'll eat about 2 to 3 times every week. So you will see smaller snakes more active typically than bigger snakes. So a lot of people will see that a pencil-sized snake is more common than a 5-foot bull snake. If you guys noticed in that video, you could kind of see how the bull snake was walking its jaw up that mouse. Here at the Nature Center, we feed all of our animals frozen mice that we have thawed just because it's the more humane way we feel. So they don't have to struggle that much with it. So it was pretty smooth for her to eat. But snakes actually are able to unhinge part of their jaw in order to open their mouth a little further. They can open it about 150 degrees, but when you really think about that, it's about twice as wide as their normal head. So when you think about those big snakes down in Africa or South America, they can eat those big mammals that you hear these terrible stories about. Snakes do not chew their food, and that's because their teeth are designed to help them push their food backwards. In this image, it's really good. You can see the teeth of that snake, how they're curved backwards. So if you ever have been bitten by a snake, it won't hurt too bad because most of the time, as soon as you are bitten by that snake, they don't bite hard enough that it'll break the skin, and the teeth won't penetrate you because they are curved backwards. So snakes have adapted to hunt in multiple different ways. A lot of snakes tend to be nocturnal, or they like being up really late at night or really early in the morning. Garter snakes are one of the only snakes that will be active during the day. But Snakes have adapted to have these sensory organs that allow them to hunt. One that a lot of people notice right away is their tongue sticking out. So this tongue is actually adapted to pick up odor particles and carry them into their mouth to that Jacobson organ. That Jacobson organ is kind of like how our nose is to our brain, and it processes what it's smelling. And then it's able to process what's in front of them and figure out if they want to eat what's sitting in front of them. And that's also how they sense what kind of food they're hunting after. Snakes do have eyeballs, you can see, but they don't really move too often in their head. They actually have a scale that covers them, so it's protected, but they also can't see very well out of that eye either. Snakes also do not have ears, but they have very specialized jawbones that will allow them to pick up vibrations, and their brain is able to process that as a sound and allow them to figure out pinpointing where they're trying to head to for their hunt. In some snakes, they do have pit organs, which I'll be going into detail a little more, but it's kind of like the infrared way of hunting. So a lot of these snakes that do have these pit organs tend to be purely nocturnal. And one that I know you guys will probably recognize is the prairie rattlesnake, because they are nocturnal and they do have those very visible pit organs. So when we get to that slide, I'll go ahead and point those out again for you. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about how they actually take down those prey. So the first one I like talking about is constrictors. In this image, I have two types of constrictors. The first one is much more of a constrictor that wraps around the entire prey. A lot of you guys might picture that kind of constrictor as the main kind of constrictor for snakes. And that is one that is more common for bigger snakes who take down bigger prey or more active prey. So one misconception with that kind of constrictor is they squeeze them so tight that their bone breaks. That is not true. So those constrictors will actually slowly tighten around their prey, making it very hard for those animals to breathe, and it'll actually cause those animals to stroke before passing away. And then the snake will eat it because then it's no longer trying to get away. The second image is actually one of the more common kind of constrictors you'll see around this area. So the second image, you can kind of see it's loosely wrapped around that mouse, and it's not really holding it with its whole body. So that constrictor is actually using its jaw to hold it in place, so it has a much stronger jaw, and then as soon as it is able to bite its prey, it lumps its body onto it, so it's having a harder time getting away. And of course, this is where I'm going to go ahead and switch to the venomous snakes. So here you can see the inside of the venom organ for the snakes and their fangs. You can see where the venom duct is. I like kind of talking about venomous snakes because a lot of people tend to call venomous snakes poisonous snakes. So there actually is poisonous snakes, but it doesn't mean the same thing as venomous snakes. Poisonous snakes will actually live in Asia, and the reason they are poisonous is if you actually ingest a piece of them, that you will actually die from the poison that you've eaten. But the venomous snakes are actually ones that will bite you and inject you with venom, which will cause multiple different things to happen. There are different types of venom which will affect the human in a different way. Some will clog up your pores, some will cause your heart to start deteriorating, and some will kind of just make you go crazy. So it's very important to be able to identify venomous snakes. And in this image, I like pointing out, if you can look at the eye, it's a very good illustration of venomous snake's eyes because it is a circle, but in the middle, it looks like a cat eye. So all venomous snakes will actually have that kind of shape to their eye. They'll have a cat eye compared to most constrictors or non-venomous snakes. They will have a circle eye. And some of the images you'll see in a little bit, you'll be able to see the circle eye for a non-venomous snake versus the cat eye, I like saying, for the venomous snakes. So one thing I like pointing out here is, can you see that protective sheath right underneath that vein, that fang? How when the snake is opening its mouth and that fang is coming out, that skin that's kind of connecting it to the top of its mouth, that will actually also help pull that tooth in for when the snake's mouth is closed. So the fang isn't always sticking straight down for venomous snakes. When they are closing their mouth, that tooth will kind of shift into a backward position, so it's able to store its mouth more comfortably compared to having it straight down the whole time. Some venomous snakes will have shorter fangs, and those shorter fangs will be able to stay projected out, but most of the time they try to be able to fold those in. And you can also see that the venom, those fangs will actually either be hollow or have a groove that will allow that venom to go into that tooth and be injected, or along that tooth be injected into their prey. So here in Iowa, we have 28 different snake species, but here in Woodbury County, we have recorded about 10. So I'm going to go over a few of our snakes and how to identify them and something unique about each one of those snakes. Of course, I'm going to go ahead and go over the garter snake first. I decided to put the plains garter snake and the common garter snake together on this slide. This is because they are very similar. They both have the same kind of habits and live in the similar areas, but you can see in those small snippets of the images I have of their bodies, you can identify the differences between the two based on where those lines are. So in the plains garter snake, can you all see that yellow line that goes through it in the middle of its body? And this is from the side view, of course. That white part is their belly, and there's a black lateral line between the yellow and their belly. So that is a good identification to know that you are looking at a plains garter snake, compared to that common garter snake, where that lateral line is more of a cream color, and it's nearly right next to that belly. There might be a thin line of black, but it's pretty much right there. Some other things you can look at to identify the differences between the two is a lot of times common garter snakes will have a little bit of a red tint, and the only yellow that will be on the common garter snake is the one line that goes down the middle of its back, compared to the plains garter snake, which will have an orange stripe going down its back and two yellow ones along its side. The next one I'm going to talk about is the ringneck snake. So if you all have been out here to the Dorothy Pecaut Nature Center, you guys have seen our pollinator garden. This last week when I was working in that garden, I actually found one of these ringneck snakes. So this might be one that you guys might run into in your gardens yourself. So this is a harmless to human snake, and it's very small. The max it can reach is about 15 inches. The one I found was about 5 inches, and it was barely big enough for me to hold on to. So they're typically fairly small, and they like being in very dark spots. They're not much for being out in the sun. They are more of a late evening snake. You'll start seeing these guys right now, this time of year, and they'll continue seeing them until October. If you guys live along a forest, kind of like here at Dorothy Pecaut Nature Center, we are surrounded by forest, and you guys use rocks in your garden or bricks in your garden to line the edges. If you ever go to move one of those bricks, you might encounter one of these snakes, but thank goodness they are pretty helpful, at controlling insects in the garden, but sadly they do go after earthworms also. So if you ever do catch one of these and you don't want it in your garden, you could always bring it out and release it into an area where it's more of a rain garden or there's a lot more rocks and you don't mind controlling the bugs in that area. The next one I'm going to go ahead and talk about is the eastern milk snake. So a lot of people see this one and they think, oh, it kind of reminds me of that saying that about coral snakes, which we don't have here in Iowa. And that's because they have a very vivid color. So the coloration will vary in this species. They can look a little more bright, vivid colors, but they also can have a very ground-like color to them too. Typically, they can be about 2 feet to about 3-4 feet. They can be, typically what I find is about 1.5 feet of them out here in the nature center, but they're not very common here in Woodbury County. Typically, they're found further south. So it is pretty unique to find them. Unlike a lot of people like making the joke about milk snakes that they eat cow milk, they actually do not. They drink water, and they do tend to predate on most prey, so they're pretty good to keep around if you have a lot of mice or if you have some other reptile issues in your garden. Next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the brown snake. The brown snake, sometimes people get a little worried when I start talking about them because there is a brown snake known to be venomous. So this snake is not a venomous type of brown snake. It is known, it is protected here in Iowa, sorry, and it can be about 13 to 18 inches in length. It is harmless to humans and typically will go after snails, slugs, and small amphibians. Typically, you'll find these more in marshy areas along rivers and streams. So if you live here in Siouxland near the river or along a wetter bank of the area, you might actually find a few of these in your yard. Next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Graham's crayfish snake. It gets its name because crayfish are one of the main things that it tries to eat, but sometimes it is known to eat fish and amphibians. We do not have that here in Woodbury County, but we do have evidence of it being in Monona County. It does have a very specific diet, so it is hard to maintain that for them in locations like here, but there are a lot more floodplains and damp areas known in Monona County. The North American racer is the next one I am talking about, and it gets its name because it is one of the faster snakes, and it can be a little intimidating to run into one of these snakes because they do strike very fast. They tend to go after prey that they get a chase from, so they like chasing after their prey and will go after faster things like rabbits, mice, and things like that. Next, I'm talking about the smooth green snake. It's one of my favorites, and it's kind of cool because it is purely an insectivore. So that means it will only eat insects. And typically you won't find these too many places, especially here. We won't find them here in Woodbury County, but they will be found in meadows and areas that are covered in green. That's because they're able to blend in much better and are able to camouflage themselves from predators. Since they only eat insects, they tend to have a lot more predators because they don't have too much of a defensive mechanism for themselves. The next one I have is the hognose snake. I have mentioned this one a couple times, and the main reason I like talking about this one so much is because they are an endangered species here in Iowa. They are the goofiest snake because they do play dead and they flatten their head to try to protect themselves. So it's like they try to be very intimidating until they know they're not, and then they play dead so they're no longer, they don't look tasty anymore to their prey or their predators. So typically you'll start seeing these in late spring into early fall. And they do live in a habitat that is more gravelly and sandy, but here in Iowa, a lot of the gravelly, sandy prairies have been destroyed, and that's where they made most of their population. That's where most of their habitat was. That is also along with the bull snake, which I'll be talking about later, and also the ornate box turtle, which is another threatened species here in Iowa. The western fox snake is the next one. We actually have a western fox snake here at the Dorothy Pecaut Nature Center, and they live here they're probably one of the most common snakes you'll run into that isn't a garter snake or a ringneck snake. And typically you'll find them in woodlands and woodland edges. If you do live on an acreage, I've heard a lot of people have been running into them lately, and it's because they're just starting to come out of hibernation. They will mostly eat rats and rodents, so they're great to keep in your gardening area because they'll manage those rodents from getting into your garden and taking over some of your seeding areas. And now I'm going to talk about the bull snake. So I did mention earlier, it is a special concerned animal here in Iowa, and that is because of its habitat being destroyed, similar to the hognose snake and the ornate box turtle. But the bull snake is very common here in Woodbury County. It's very, very common compared to other parts of this state. And so when we walk outside and see one, it's not too uncommon, and we don't get too wowed by it. But it is very important for us to consider that they are on their way to becoming endangered. We do have one here at the Nature Center, as you've seen, and she has laid eggs before. So we kind of feel a little guilty, but those eggs are not fertile, and we know that she would never be able to take care of herself if we were to release her. Something I like talking about after talking about the bull snake and the fox snake is their coloration. If you guys had noticed, especially with that fox snake photo, they have a very distinct pattern where they're lighter brown with dark black or dark brown spots all over their body. A lot of times these snakes are mistaken for venomous snakes here in Iowa. So a lot of people tend to take care of these snakes by killing them because they feel threatened from them living on their land. And if you guys remember, I always try to remind people that the eyes are something you want to look at when you are having a hard time identifying. Obviously, you want to be at a safe distance from that snake, but before you make any rash decisions, it's good to take that into consideration because both of these snakes will shake their tail and hiss very loudly in order to make themselves look like a rattlesnake because that is their defense mechanism. That is how they try to protect themselves. But it is very sad because of their populations being impacted by people killing them because they think they are a prairie rattlesnake. The next image will be of a prairie rattlesnake. So you can kind of see that coloration pattern from the bull snake and the fox snake, how it is a light brown main body with blotches that are dark brown or black. So this is the only venomous snake that could possibly come into this area. It has never been recorded in Woodbury County, so I'm not really too concerned. It is in one population up in Plymouth County, and that's the only place here in Iowa that it's ever been recorded. It is an endangered species, so it is good that we know where these populations are so we're able to protect them. And they are dangerously venomous. So if you do get bitten by them, you have to make sure you do not worry, do not freak out, because that will make your adrenaline rush the blood through your body, and it will make the venom tend to take course faster. You do want to get to a hospital as soon as you do get bitten by one of these, but it's make sure you don't over worry yourself, because otherwise it might impact your body a little faster. Like I said, they are very common in South Dakota, and they are one of the leading snakes for snake bites. So they are about 82% of the snake bites that happen in the US. So that's kind of interesting because they are pretty docile when it comes down to it. If you do see one and you find it and walk away, they're not going to chase after you. but a lot of people tend to mess with rattlesnakes when they do find them because they find it entertaining to mess with them. So we always try to make sure that we talk about how they're endangered and how we need to protect the species because of that. And just a kind of quick once over of all the rest of the venomous snakes that we have here in Iowa. None of them do live here in Plymouth County or Woodbury County. The copperhead, like I said, lives in southwest Iowa. The Massasauga actually has two different types of species here in Iowa. One is the western and one is the eastern. Massasauga actually is a Chippewa word, one of the Native American tribes around here, and it actually means a great river mouth, so I found that to be kind of fun. And finally is the timber rattlesnake. This is one of the most docile rattlesnakes, period. It is also the third largest in the US. So it's pretty mild and it doesn't really like moving too often. So if you ever do find one, typically you're able to get away without even noticing it was there because it's typically under a rock and hiding during the day. And you'll definitely be able to notice what it looks like because it does have black chevron bands on its back. So what do you do when you do find a snake in your garden? Well, you kind of have to establish what you really want to do with that snake. So first, figure out what kind of snake is it? Is it a garter snake? Is it a prairie ringneck snake? Or is it a fox snake? Do you care if any of those are in your garden, taking care of all of the pests that you might find there? If you don't really mind, it's always great to leave them alone. And if you want to attract more snakes to your garden, create habitat for them by leaving planks of wood against your shed or leaving a rock pile so they're able to find a place to hibernate or stay safe during the day. If you want to try to get rid of them, try to mow your grass really short, like I said, so they're scared of predators like hawks flying above them and spotting them. Try to remove places where they would like to nest or stay, like the rocks and the planks. Try to remove those from your yard. And also try to seal any openings to your house or garages so they're not making it indoors. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this, and I'm open for questions.
Olivia, I don't see any questions right now in the chat box, but if anybody does have one, if you would go ahead and write that in. I would just say when I was growing up, we had rattlesnakes in the middle of Nebraska where I was growing up and saw them very often and learned very quickly from relatives out on the farm when we would go out and see them to really be very cautious around them.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you telling about that.
Oh yeah, I've had a lot of great memories of going and catching snakes with my brothers. One of the questions I see is, how's the best way to pick up a snake? So personally, from my experience, you just grab it and you try to hold it for as far back on its body away from its head. As long as you know that it is a non-venomous snake, you are able to reach out and grab those snakes and carry it from its lower half. I wouldn't recommend grabbing it from right at the tip just because you might cause some spinal damage. And the longer you hold it, the worse it becomes. If you are comfortable enough, you can move your hand up right behind its head and hold right behind where its neck would be in order to prevent it from twisting around and biting you. And that is more for uses if you were to trying to study something with that snake. Of course, a lot of snakes, as soon as you do pick up a snake, they just kind of are like, oh, I am in your hands. I'm not going to do anything because if I bite you, you're going to throw me or hurt me. So they're just going to kind of sit there frozen in your arms. With rattlesnakes, from what my experience, normally we have this pole that you have a little tooth or a bend at one end. You pick it up with that like 4-foot pole and you put it in a bucket and you put a lid on that bucket. So If you're not comfortable with snakes, you can always try to pick it up with a 4-foot pole and stick it in a bucket, even if it's not venomous. And that will be one way to transport it to a different location away from where you are.
Another one in there that I see, Olivia, is the blue racer the same as you described?
So the racer that we have in this area is more of a red-brown racer. I can go back to that slide. You're able to see the species name. Let me see if I can. But there are quite a few racer species here in the US. Right there, you can see the species name. So this is a North American racer, so it will be different than the blue racer. This is the species we do have here in Iowa. The blue racer will typically have more of a grayish blue color. This one has more of a brownish gray and has a white underbelly.